I never imagined that a single signed paper could unravel a whole family. And yet, that's exactly what happened in a sprawling mansion on the edge of Miami's glittering coastline. The billionaire had made a choice that stunned everyone. He signed the papers to let his son go. The silence that followed was deafening. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. Maria Elena Vasquez had known the weight of invisible work since she was 12 years old. Her hands, weathered by decades of scrubbing floors in houses that cost more than entire neighborhoods in her hometown, moved with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to find dignity in service. Each morning she rode the crowded metro bus from her small apartment in Little Havana, watching the city transform from working-class storefronts to gleaming towers of wealth as she traveled toward the exclusive enclave of Star Island. The Callahan estate stood like a monument to money itself. 38,000 square feet of marble and glass overlooking Biscayne Bay, where yachts worth millions bobbed like expensive toys. Inside, the mansion breathed with the cold perfection that only unlimited wealth could buy. Italian marble floors stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers, each room curated by interior designers whose fees exceeded most people's annual salaries. Yet for all its grandeur, the house felt hollow, as if the very walls had absorbed years of unspoken pain. Frederick Callahan III was a man whose name appeared regularly in Forbes magazine and whose investment portfolio included everything from cryptocurrency holdings worth hundreds of millions to prime real estate across 3 continents. He had built his fortune through a combination of ruthless business acumen and an almost supernatural ability to predict market trends. His ventures ranged from tech startups that had gone public for billions to gold mines in South Africa. But wealth, Maria had learned, could not buy the one thing Frederick desperately needed: peace with his own son. Anthony Callahan was 28 years old and carried himself with the particular arrogance that came from never having wanted for anything, except perhaps his father's approval. Brilliant and reckless in equal measure, Anthony had spent his youth bouncing between boarding schools and rehabilitation centers, his trust fund enabling a lifestyle of fast cars, expensive parties, and relationships that burned out as quickly as his father's patience. The final confrontation had come 6 months earlier, after Anthony had lost nearly $10 million in a failed cryptocurrency venture that Frederick had explicitly warned him against. The legal papers Frederick signed that cold February morning were as final as death certificates. With his signature, he severed all financial ties to his son, removed him from the family trust, and effectively erased Anthony from the business empire that bore their name. The lawyer who witnessed the signing later described the moment as watching a man bury his own heart. But Frederick's face remained stone cold, his decision absolute. Maria had been working in the Callahan mansion for only 3 weeks when the papers were signed, but she had already witnessed the toxic silence that poisoned every corner of the house. She arrived each morning at 5:30, her worn sneakers silent against the imported marble as she began her daily routine of maintaining a palace that felt more like a mausoleum. The other staff members, the chef who trained in Paris, the groundskeepers who maintained the 3-acre property, the security team that monitored every entrance, treated her with the casual dismissiveness reserved for those they considered beneath notice. The morning bus ride to Star Island gave Maria time to prepare herself mentally for another day of being invisible. She would sit near the back, watching Miami wake up through scratched windows. The construction workers heading to build more towers for the wealthy, the cleaning ladies like herself traveling toward houses they would never own, the endless stream of service workers who kept the machinery of wealth running smoothly. Her reflection in the window showed a woman of 52 whose dark eyes held depths that spoke of survival, loss, and an unbreakable core of dignity that no amount of condescension could touch. The mansion's morning routine never varied. Maria would enter through the service entrance, change into her uniform in a small room next to the industrial-grade laundry facility, and begin her work in the vast kitchen that rarely saw actual cooking. Most meals were prepared by the chef, elaborate affairs that often went untouched as family members ate in their separate wings of the house. Maria's job was to maintain the spaces between, the endless hallways lined with artwork worth more than most homes, the library filled with first editions that no one read, the sitting rooms arranged for conversations that never happened. On this particular morning, something was different. Frederick sat alone at the massive dining table, staring at a set of legal documents spread before him like accusatory fingers. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his silver hair uncombed, his expensive suit wrinkled from a sleepless night. The papers bore his fresh signature, bold and decisive, yet his hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Maria moved quietly around the room, dusting furniture that was already spotless, her presence as unnoticed as the air itself. She had learned long ago that wealthy people often forgot that their help had eyes and ears, that they witnessed the private moments of pain and rage that the rich preferred to keep hidden. As she worked, she could feel the weight of Frederick's anguish filling the room like smoke, and something deep in her chest, the part of her that had comforted her own children through their darkest moments, stirred with unexpected sympathy. The sound of footsteps on marble announced Anthony's arrival, and Maria instinctively moved toward the far wall, making herself even more invisible. The young man entered with the particular energy of someone preparing for battle, his expensive clothes somehow making him look younger and more vulnerable than his years. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from what had clearly been a sleepless night of his own. "Is it done, then?" Anthony's voice carried a tremor that belied his attempt at casual indifference. He stared at the papers on the table as if they might burst into flames. Frederick didn't look up. His voice, when it came, was flat and emotionless. "The lawyers were very thorough. You're no longer financially connected to this family or its assets. The apartment in South Beach, the car, the credit cards, all of it stops today." "And that's it? 28 years and you just sign me away?" For the first time, Frederick raised his eyes to meet his son's. The pain Maria saw there was so raw, so profound, that she had to grip her cleaning cloth tighter to keep from gasping aloud. "You made your choice, Anthony. The cryptocurrency disaster was the last straw. I warned you, and you ignored me. This family's wealth isn't a toy for you to gamble with." Anthony slammed his hand against the table, making the China coffee service jump. "This isn't about money, Dad, and you know it. This is about Mom. You've been punishing me for her death ever since—" "Don't!" Frederick's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare bring your mother into this!" The silence that followed was so complete that Maria could hear her own heartbeat. She had stumbled into a moment too private, too painful for any outside witness, yet she found herself unable to move, frozen by the magnitude of the grief that seemed to emanate from both men. Anthony's voice, when he spoke again, was barely above a whisper. "She wouldn't have wanted this. Mom would never have wanted you to throw me away like garbage." Frederick's composure cracked, just for a moment, and Maria saw him for what he truly was. Not a billionaire businessman, but a broken father who had lost his way in the labyrinth of his own pain. "Your mother isn't here to see what you become. I am, and I won't watch you destroy everything she and I built together." The young man turned and walked toward the door, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire house. At the threshold, he paused without turning back. "When you realize what you've done, Dad, don't come looking for me. Those papers you signed work both ways." The mansion settled into a silence so profound that Maria could hear the distant sound of waves against the seawall outside. Frederick remained at the table, surrounded by legal documents that had just redefined his entire world. His billion-dollar empire, his properties scattered across the globe, his investments in everything from blue-chip stocks to cutting-edge technology, none of it mattered in the face of the void his son's departure had left behind. Maria continued her work, moving like a ghost through rooms that suddenly felt even more empty than before. But as she worked, she carried with her the image of Frederick's face in that moment when his composure had cracked. She recognized that expression, had seen it in her own mirror during the darkest days after her husband's death. when the world seemed too vast and too cold to navigate alone. It was the look of someone who had won every battle except the one that mattered most. The day stretched on with the peculiar heaviness that follows irreversible decisions. Maria noticed that Frederick didn't leave for his office as he usually did, instead wandering the mansion like a man who had lost his way in his own home. The staff whispered among themselves about the morning's confrontation, their gossip carrying the particular cruelty that servants sometimes reserved for their employer's pain. But Maria remained silent, her thoughts occupied by the memory of a father's breaking heart and a son's desperate plea for understanding that had fallen on ears deafened by grief and pride. As evening approached and the Florida sun began its descent toward the horizon, Maria prepared to leave for her long journey home to Little Havana. But something made her pause at the service entrance, some instinct that told her the story of the signed papers and the severed family was far from over. The mansion's silence felt different now, not just empty but waiting, as if the very walls were holding their breath for whatever would come next. The bus ride home took Maria through the heart of Miami's most exclusive neighborhoods before depositing her back in the vibrant chaos of her own world. Here, music spilled from open windows, the smell of Cuban coffee mixed with car exhaust and frying plantains, and children played in streets that had never known the sterile perfection of Star Island. As she climbed the stairs to her small apartment, Maria carried with her the weight of what she had witnessed. A family's destruction played out in a room filled with priceless objects that couldn't purchase the one thing money never could: the ability to heal a broken heart. She had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, the Callahan family's story would take a turn that would challenge everything she thought she knew about loyalty, love, and the dangerous territory between right and wrong. The signed papers had been just the beginning, and Maria Elena Vasquez, invisible maid and unwilling witness to a billionaire's pain, was about to find herself at the center of a crisis that would test the very foundations of her carefully constructed moral world. The next morning arrived with the particular humidity that promised another scorching Miami day, and Maria began her journey to the Callahan estate with the same quiet determination that had carried her through 52 years of survival. She had learned long ago that life rarely offered the luxury of simple choices, and as the bus carried her toward Star Island, she found herself wondering what new sorrows would greet her in the marble halls of the mansion that wealth had built, but happiness had long since abandoned. The service entrance of the Callahan mansion opened to reveal a house transformed overnight, not by any physical change, but by an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension and the particular energy that follows in the wake of family destruction. Maria stepped into the familiar sterile perfection of the staff area, changed into her uniform, and began her morning ritual of maintaining spaces that seemed to grow more beautiful and more empty with each passing day. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came from Consuela, the head of housekeeping, whose usually commanding presence seemed subdued as she distributed the day's assignments. At 63, Consuela had worked for wealthy families across Miami for over 4 decades, and her weathered face carried the particular expression of someone who had seen too many family dramas play out behind closed doors. She pulled Maria aside with the urgency of shared secrets. "Listen to me carefully," Consuela whispered in Spanish, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Mr. Anthony came back last night, late, very late. The security cameras caught him using his old key code, but by the time Mr. Frederick woke up, he was already gone." Her dark eyes held a worry that went deeper than concern for job security. "Something is missing from the safe in the master bedroom. Something valuable." Maria's stomach tightened with the instinctive dread that comes when you sense disaster approaching. "What kind of something?" "The kind that could send a person to prison," Consuela replied grimly. "Bearer bonds, cryptocurrency wallet codes, maybe even cash. Mr. Frederick discovered it this morning and—" She shook her head. "I've never seen him like this. Not angry, beyond angry, cold, like ice." The implications hit Maria like a physical blow. Anthony, cut off from his family's wealth by his father's signature, had apparently decided to take what he felt was rightfully his. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than simple theft. It was the confirmation of every harsh judgment Frederick had made about his son's character, and Maria could imagine the particular agony of a father watching his worst fears about his child come true. As she began her work on the mansion's main floor, Maria could hear the aftermath of the discovery echoing through the vast spaces. Frederick's voice, normally controlled to the point of emotional sterility, carried a rage that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. He was on the phone with what sounded like lawyers, then security companies, then someone who was clearly law enforcement. The words theft, prosecution, and full extent of the law drifted through the marble hallways like a curse being spoken into existence. Dr. Helena Morrison, Frederick's sister and the mansion's only regular visitor, arrived shortly after noon with the particular urgency of someone trying to prevent a catastrophe. A successful cardiologist whose own wealth was considerable but modest compared to her brother's empire, Helena had always served as the family's voice of reason. Maria had observed her over the weeks as the one person who could occasionally penetrate Frederick's emotional armor, and today she would need every ounce of that influence. The confrontation took place in Frederick's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a desk that had once belonged to a railroad baron. Maria was cleaning the adjacent library when their voices rose high enough to carry through the heavy oak doors, and she found herself an unwilling audience to another family crisis unfolding in real time. "You cannot do this, Frederick." Helena's voice carried the particular firmness that came from years of delivering bad news to patients and their families. "He's your son, your only child. If you have him arrested, there's no coming back from that. Ever." Frederick's response was sharp enough to cut glass. "He's a thief, Helena. He violated every trust, broke every promise, and now he's stolen from his own family. What would you have me do? Pretend it didn't happen? Enable him further?" "I would have you remember that grief makes people do terrible things," Helena shot back. "You've both been drowning in it since Catherine died, and instead of helping each other heal, you've been tearing each other apart. This theft, yes, it's wrong, it's criminal, but it's also the desperate act of a young man who feels like his father has already written him off as worthless." There was a long pause, and when Frederick spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him years in moments. "The bonds alone are worth $12 million, Helena. The cryptocurrency codes give access to another $20 million. This isn't some desperate grab for grocery money. This is calculated, sophisticated theft." Maria's cleaning cloth stilled in her hand as the numbers sank in. $32 million. It was more money than her entire neighborhood would see in their combined lifetimes, stolen by a young man who had grown up surrounded by luxury, but had apparently never learned the difference between wanting something and deserving it. "And if you have him arrested?" Helena pressed. "If you send your own son to prison? What then? You'll have your money back, but you'll have lost Anthony forever. Is that really what Catherine would have wanted? Is that the legacy she'd want you to leave?" The mention of his deceased wife seemed to strike Frederick like a physical blow. Maria could hear the scrape of a chair being pushed back, footsteps pacing across expensive Persian rugs, the sound of a man wrestling with demons that no amount of wealth could exorcise. "Don't use Catherine against me," Frederick said finally, his voice hollow. "She's gone. She's been gone for 2 years, and I've had to make every impossible decision alone. Anthony has shown me exactly who he is, a spoiled child who takes what he wants without consequence. Well, there are consequences now." Helena's next words carried the particular desperation of someone watching a family destroy itself in slow motion. "There's another way, Frederick. Give him a chance to return what he stole. Don't involve the police yet. Give him 24 hours to come to his senses and make this right." The silence that followed stretched so long that Maria began to wonder if the conversation had ended. When Frederick finally spoke, his words carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "I'll give him 12 hours. If the bonds and the cryptocurrency access codes aren't returned by midnight tonight, I'm calling the FBI. Anthony made his choice when he violated every trust I ever placed in him. Now, I'm making mine." Maria heard Helena leave the study with the particular heaviness of someone who had failed to prevent a tragedy. The mansion settled into an even deeper silence than usual, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for whatever would come next. Throughout the afternoon, Frederick remained in his study, visible through the glass doors as a figure hunched over legal documents and financial statements, calculating the exact extent of his son's betrayal with the same methodical precision he brought to all his business dealings. As evening approached, Maria found herself cleaning areas of the house she had already cleaned twice, unable to focus on anything other than the approaching midnight deadline. The theft of $32 million was certainly a crime worthy of federal prosecution, but she couldn't shake the image of Anthony's face from the morning before, the desperate plea in his eyes when he had begged his father not to throw him away like garbage. The other staff members sensed the tension as well, moving through their duties with the particular carefulness that comes when you know you're working in a house where a family is tearing itself apart. The chef prepared Frederick's dinner as usual, though it went largely untouched. The groundskeepers maintained the 3-acre property with their usual precision, though the beauty of the landscaping seemed mocked by the ugliness unfolding inside the mansion's walls. At 11 o'clock, with 1 hour remaining until Frederick's ultimatum expired, Maria was finishing her final tasks of the day when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The front door of the mansion, not the service entrance she always used, but the grand main entrance that opened onto the circular driveway where Frederick's collection of luxury cars sat like expensive sculptures, opened with the particular authority of someone who belonged there. Anthony had returned. The young man who walked into the mansion's grand foyer looked nothing like the defiant figure who had stormed out the day before. His expensive clothes were rumpled. His face showed the particular exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent wrestling with conscience, and his hand shook as he carried a leather briefcase that seemed to weigh far more than its contents should suggest. Maria watched from the shadows of the main staircase as Frederick emerged from his study to face his son. The two men stood 20 feet apart on the marble floor of the foyer, surrounded by artwork worth millions and illuminated by a crystal chandelier that had been purchased at auction from a European palace. Yet for all the grandeur of their surroundings, they looked like two exhausted soldiers meeting on a battlefield where there could be no winners. "I brought them back," Anthony said, his voice barely above a whisper. He set the briefcase on an antique table that had once belonged to a railroad magnate. "The bonds, the cryptocurrency wallet information, all of it." Frederick's response was flat, emotionless. "And you thought that would make this right? You thought you could just return what you stole and pretend it never happened?" Anthony's composure cracked, and for a moment Maria saw not a sophisticated thief, but a lost child who had made a terrible mistake. I thought if I could get enough money to prove I could make it on my own, you might. You might respect me, might see that I wasn't the failure you think I am." "You broke into my safe," Frederick said, his voice growing harder with each word. "You stole bearer bonds and cryptocurrency access codes worth $32 million. And you want me to believe this was about earning respect?" The young man's shoulders sagged under the weight of his father's judgment. "I know how it sounds. I know what I did was wrong. But Dad, I've been drowning ever since Mom died, and instead of helping me, you've been pushing me further underwater. I felt like if I couldn't prove my worth to you financially, I had nothing left." Frederick walked to the briefcase and opened it, his movements precise and businesslike as he verified its contents. The bearer bonds were there, negotiable securities that could be cashed by whoever possessed them. The handwritten codes that provided access to cryptocurrency wallets worth millions were neatly organized in a manila folder. Everything appeared to be accounted for, yet the damage to the family's foundation seemed beyond calculation. "The FBI is expecting my call," Frederick said without looking up from the briefcase. "I told them I would contact them by midnight if the stolen property wasn't returned. It's 11:47. Anthony looked as if he had been struck. "You're still going to have me arrested, even though I brought everything back?" "You committed federal crimes, Anthony. Theft of bearer bonds is a felony that carries up to 20 years in prison. The cryptocurrency theft adds additional charges. The fact that you return the property doesn't erase what you did. Maria watched from her position on the staircase as a father and son faced each other across a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each exchanged word. She thought of her own children, grown now and living their own complicated lives, and tried to imagine any scenario in which she would choose legal justice over family healing. The cold precision of Frederick's response, while perhaps legally justified, seemed to echo through the marble halls like the sound of a heart breaking. "Please," Anthony said, and the single word carried more vulnerability than any lengthy speech could have conveyed. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've disappointed you, but I'm still your son. Doesn't that count for anything?" For just a moment, Frederick's composed mask slipped, and Maria saw the same raw pain she had witnessed the morning before when he had signed the papers severing financial ties with his son. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady and implacable. "Being my son is exactly why this hurts so much," he said quietly, "and it's exactly why I can't let it pass. If I don't hold you accountable now, when will it end? What's the next crisis going to cost our family?" The mansion's grandfather clock began to chime midnight, its deep bronze notes echoing through the foyer as if marking not just the passage of time, but the final moments of whatever remained of the Callahan family bond. Anthony stood frozen as the chimes continued, understanding that each note brought him closer to a point of no return. But as the clock's final chime faded into silence, something unexpected happened. Frederick reached for his phone, held it for a long moment, then slowly set it back down without making the call. "I'm not calling the FBI tonight," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not because you don't deserve prosecution, but because your mother—" His voice caught, and for the first time since Maria had been working in the mansion, she saw Frederick Callahan's carefully maintained composure completely collapse. "Because your mother would never forgive me if I sent her son to prison, no matter what he had done." Anthony took a step toward his father, hope flickering across his features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, but Frederick held up a hand to stop him. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness," he said, his voice regaining its steel. "You're still cut off from the family money. You're still not welcome in this house. The only difference is that you won't be spending the next 20 years in federal prison. Consider it my final gift to Catherine's memory, not to you." Maria watched as Anthony's brief moment of hope died as quickly as it had been born. The young man nodded slowly, picking up his jacket from where he had dropped it near the door. As he reached the threshold, he turned back one final time. "When you're sitting alone in this big, empty house," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face, "remember that you chose money over family. You chose being right over being a father, and Mom. Mom is watching from wherever she is, seeing what you've become." The front door closed behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through every marble hallway and empty room of the mansion. Frederick stood alone in the foyer, surrounded by the returned millions and the crystal chandelier's expensive light, yet looking like the poorest man on earth. As Maria finally emerged from the shadows and made her way toward the service entrance to end her longest day at the Callahan estate, she carried with her the image of a father who had chosen justice over mercy, law over love, and in doing so had perhaps lost the most valuable thing his billions could never replace: his son's chance at redemption and their family's possibility of healing. The next chapter of the Callahan family's story was about to begin, though none of them could have predicted the role that Maria Elena Vasquez, invisible witness to their pain, would soon play in determining whether this broken family would find a path back to each other or destroy themselves completely in the process. The morning after Anthony's midnight departure brought a silence to the Callahan mansion that felt different from the usual emptiness. It was the silence of finality, of bridges burned and chances lost forever. Maria arrived at the service entrance to find the atmosphere among the staff charged with a nervous energy that spoke of secrets shared in whispers and gossip that would soon spread throughout Miami's network of domestic workers. Consuela met her at the staff entrance with the particular expression of someone who had witnessed too many family tragedies unfold behind the closed doors of wealthy homes. "He's in his study," she said without preamble, her weathered hands gesturing toward the wing of the house where Frederick had barricaded himself since his son's departure. "Hasn't eaten since yesterday. Won't speak to anyone. The other staff are saying he's finally lost his mind." Maria nodded silently, understanding that she was being assigned to clean the areas closest to Frederick's self-imposed isolation. In the complex hierarchy of domestic work, the newest employee usually received the most difficult or uncomfortable tasks, and today that meant maintaining spaces, while carefully avoiding the presence of a billionaire wrestling with the consequences of his own choices. As she began her morning routine, Maria could sense the change in the mansion's atmosphere. The expensive artwork seemed to watch her with judgmental eyes. The marble floors echoed with the particular hollowness that comes when a house realizes it has witnessed the destruction of the family it was built to shelter. Even the Florida sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows felt muted, as if the very building was mourning. The study where Frederick had isolated himself was visible through glass-paneled French doors, and as Maria worked in the adjacent spaces, she could see him hunched over his massive desk like a man trying to bury his grief in paperwork. The leather-bound ledgers and financial documents spread across the mahogany surface represented billions in assets: real estate holdings from Manhattan to Monaco, stock portfolios that moved markets, cryptocurrency investments that had multiplied exponentially over the past decade. Yet for all his wealth, Frederick Callahan looked like the poorest man alive. Around noon, Dr. Helena Morrison arrived with the particular urgency of someone who had been making difficult rounds at the hospital and was now required to make an even more difficult visit to her brother. Maria was polishing silver in the dining room when Helena entered the study without knocking, her medical bag in one hand and a determined expression on her face that suggested she was prepared to treat Frederick's emotional wounds whether he wanted her help or not. Their conversation was initially too quiet to overhear, but as Helena's attempts at gentle persuasion met Frederick's stubborn refusal to engage with anything beyond his business documents, their voices began to rise with the particular desperation that comes when family members watch each other self-destruct in real time. "You can't live like this, Frederick." Helena's voice carried through the glass doors with professional authority tinged by personal concern. "You haven't slept, you've barely eaten, and you're acting like a man who's decided to punish himself for the rest of his life." Frederick's response was muffled by distance and emotion, but Maria could hear the exhaustion in his tone. "I made the right choice, Helena. Legally, morally, fiscally. I did what any responsible parent would do when their child commits federal crimes." "You did what a CEO would do," Helena shot back, her voice carrying the particular sharpness that medical professionals used when delivering unwelcome diagnoses. "What a businessman would do. What a man who values his balance sheet more than his family would do. But Frederick, you're not just a billionaire, you're a father. And fathers are supposed to find ways to save their children, not destroy them." There was a long pause, and when Frederick spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that Maria had never heard before. "He stole $32 million from me, Helena, from his own family. How do I forgive something like that? How do I tell Catherine's memory that I just overlooked our son stealing enough money to fund a small country's budget?" Helena's response came with the gentleness of someone who understood that grief could twist love into something unrecognizable. "You forgive it the same way Catherine would have forgiven it. By remembering that Anthony is in pain too. By remembering that people who are drowning sometimes grab onto things they shouldn't. By choosing to be the parent who saves instead of the parent who punishes." Maria found herself pausing in her work, her cleaning cloth still in her hands as she listened to a conversation that felt too personal to overhear, yet too important to ignore. The mention of Catherine, Frederick's deceased wife, whose presence still seemed to haunt every corner of the mansion, triggered something deep in her own memory, a recognition of the particular agony that comes when love becomes complicated by loss. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the mansion settled into an even deeper quiet than usual. Helena had left after extracting a promise from Frederick to eat something and get some sleep, though Maria doubted he would honor either commitment. The other staff members completed their duties with the efficiency of people who understood that their employer's personal dramas were beyond their influence or concern. But Maria found herself unable to shake the image of Frederick alone in his study, surrounded by the mathematical precision of his wealth while drowning in the emotional chaos of his choices. It was nearly 7 o'clock when Maria encountered something that would change not only her own life but the entire trajectory of the Callahan family's future. She was cleaning one of the mansion's many guest bathrooms when she discovered, tucked behind an ornate gilded mirror, a small digital device that didn't belong there. Her first thought was that it might be some kind of security equipment, but closer inspection revealed it to be a recording device. Sophisticated, expensive, and clearly placed there intentionally. Maria's heart began to race as the implications became clear. Someone had been secretly recording conversations in the Callahan mansion, and given the device's placement in a bathroom frequently used by guests and family members, whatever had been captured was likely private enough to be valuable to the wrong people. With trembling hands, she carefully removed the device and examined it more closely. It was clearly professional-grade equipment, the kind that might be used by private investigators or people with more sinister motives. The small LED light indicated that it had been actively recording, and Maria realized she was holding evidence of what could be a significant violation of the Callahan family's privacy. Her first instinct was to immediately report the discovery to Consuela or to Frederick himself, but something made her pause. The device's placement, its sophisticated nature, and the timing of its discovery, just days after Anthony's theft and exile, suggested a complexity that she didn't fully understand. Someone had been monitoring the Callahan family's most private moments, and Maria found herself unwilling to add another crisis to Frederick's already overwhelming burdens without understanding exactly what she had uncovered. Instead, she carefully wrapped the device in a cleaning cloth and slipped it into her uniform pocket, deciding to examine it more carefully at home where she could think through the implications without the pressure of her work environment. As she continued her duties for the remainder of the evening, Maria carried with her not just a piece of surveillance equipment, but the weight of knowledge that the Callahan family's troubles might run much deeper than a simple case of theft between father and son. The bus ride home to Little Havana gave Maria time to wrestle with questions that had no easy answers. Why would someone be secretly recording the Callahan family? Was it connected to Anthony's theft, or was it evidence of a longer-term surveillance operation? Most importantly, what was her responsibility as someone who had stumbled into knowledge that could either help the family or make their situation infinitely worse? Her small apartment in Little Havana felt like a refuge after the marble coldness of the mansion, and Maria sat at her kitchen table with a cup of Cuban coffee, examining the recording device more carefully under the warm light of her reading lamp. The equipment was definitely professional grade, the kind that law enforcement or corporate espionage specialists might use. Someone had invested significant money and planning in monitoring the Callahan family's private conversations, and Maria realized she was now in possession of evidence that could reveal not just what had been recorded, but who had been doing the recording and why. As she turned the device over in her hands, Maria thought about Frederick's isolation, his stubborn choice to prioritize legal justice over family healing, and the way money seemed to have insulated him from understanding the emotional needs of the people closest to him. She thought about Anthony's desperate attempt to steal enough money to prove his worth to a father who measured everything in financial terms, and about Helena's futile attempts to remind her brother that some things mattered more than maintaining perfect business principles. Tomorrow, Maria knew, she would have to decide whether to reveal her discovery immediately or to first try to understand what she had found and how it might be used to help or harm the family she worked for. The recording device felt heavier in her hands than any cleaning equipment she had ever carried, weighted as it was with the potential to expose secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to capture. But tonight, in the familiar warmth of her own home, surrounded by the sounds of her neighborhood's evening life, children playing in the streets, music drifting from open windows, the comforting chaos of a community where people knew each other's names and cared about each other's troubles, Maria Elena Vasquez prepared herself for another day of working in a mansion where wealth had failed to purchase the one thing money could never buy: the wisdom to choose love over law, mercy over justice, and family over the cold satisfaction of being right. The next morning's journey to Star Island carried Maria through Miami's early traffic with the particular weight of someone carrying secrets that could reshape lives. The recording device remained wrapped in tissue paper in her uniform pocket, its presence a constant reminder that she was no longer just a witness to the Callahan family's troubles, but potentially a key player in their resolution. The mansion greeted her with the same marble perfection as always, but Maria could sense subtle changes in the household dynamics. Frederick's usual morning routine of reviewing financial reports in the breakfast room had been abandoned in favor of complete isolation in his study, and the other staff members moved through their duties with the particular carefulness that comes when everyone knows the household's stability has been fundamentally compromised. Consuela pulled her aside before the morning assignments were distributed, her weathered face showing concern that went beyond professional responsibility. "The security team did a sweep yesterday," she whispered in Spanish, her voice carrying the undertones of someone who understood that wealthy families often had secrets worth protecting. "They were looking for something specific: electronic equipment, maybe recording devices. Mr. Frederick thinks someone might have been monitoring the house." Maria's heart nearly stopped. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Frederick's suspicions about surveillance occurring just one day after she had discovered the hidden recording device. She forced her expression to remain neutral while her mind raced through the implications. "Did they find anything?" she asked, her voice carefully casual. Consuela shook her head. "Nothing. But they're bringing in more sophisticated equipment today, specialists from a private security company that works with government contracts. If there's any surveillance equipment in this house, they'll find it." As Maria began her morning cleaning routine, she felt the device in her pocket like a burning ember against her leg. Every step seemed to echo with the possibility of discovery. Every glance from other staff members felt loaded with suspicion. She had perhaps hours before professional security specialists would conduct a sweep sophisticated enough to reveal not just hidden surveillance equipment, but possibly even the electromagnetic signatures of recently removed devices. The urgency of her situation became even more clear when she observed Frederick through the glass doors of his study. He was no longer alone. 3 men in expensive suits surrounded his desk, their bearing and equipment suggesting they were either high-level security consultants or law enforcement officials. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but their body language conveyed the seriousness of whatever they were discussing. Maria realized she was facing a decision that would define not just her own future, but potentially the fate of the entire Callahan family. She could remain silent and hope that the professionals wouldn't discover evidence of her involvement with the missing device. But that would leave Frederick and potentially Anthony vulnerable to whatever surveillance operation had been targeting them. Alternatively, she could reveal her discovery and hope that her intentions would be understood, but that carried the risk of being accused of complicity in whatever scheme the recording device represented. As she wrestled with these impossible choices, Maria found herself thinking about her own children, grown now but forever etched in her memory as the vulnerable young people she had once protected from a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. The mother in her recognized something familiar in the Callahan family's destruction, the particular tragedy that occurs when pride and pain prevent people from saving each other from their own worst impulses. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitable conclusion. During her lunch break, Maria approached Frederick's study with the recording device wrapped in a clean dish towel, her heart pounding with the particular terror that comes when you realize you're about to irrevocably alter the course of multiple lives. Frederick was alone when she knocked, the security consultants apparently having concluded their morning assessment. He looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been interrupted while contemplating the ruins of his own life, and Maria could see in his eyes the particular exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent wrestling with regret. Mr. Callahan, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, I found something that I think might be important to your security concerns. She placed the wrapped device on his desk and stepped back, watching as Frederick carefully unwrapped it. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp attention as he recognized what he was looking at. Where did you find this? His voice carried the controlled intensity of someone who understood they were looking at evidence of a significant violation. Behind the mirror in the guest bathroom on the second floor, Maria replied. Yesterday evening while I was cleaning. I didn't know what it was at first, but... Frederick was already reaching for his phone, but Maria's next words stopped him. Mr. Callahan, before you call anyone, there's something else you need to know. She took a deep breath, understanding that she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. I think this might be connected to your son. The silence that followed was so complete that Maria could hear the distant sound of waves against the mansion's seawall. Frederick's hand remained poised over his phone, while his eyes searched her face for signs of what she knew and how she knew it. Explain, he said simply. Maria had prepared for this moment during her sleepless night, but the actual words still came with difficulty. I've been working in houses like yours for 30 years, Mr. Callahan. I've seen families destroy themselves over money, over pride, over things that seemed important at the time but weren't worth losing each other over. And I've learned to recognize when someone is in more trouble than they know how to handle. She gestured toward the recording device. Someone has been watching your family, listening to your private conversations, recording your most vulnerable moments. That kind of surveillance isn't random, it's targeted. Someone knows something about your business, your money, or your family that makes this information valuable. Frederick's composure, already strained by days of stress and sleepless nights, began to crack as the implications became clear. You think Anthony is involved in this surveillance operation? I don't know, Maria said honestly, but I know that young people who are desperate sometimes make alliances they shouldn't make with people they shouldn't trust. And I know that if your son is involved in something bigger than just stealing from the family safe, then calling the police might put him in more danger than you realize. The recording device sat between them on the mahogany desk, like evidence of all the ways that wealth could complicate rather than simplify human relationships. Frederick stared at it, as if it might reveal not just what conversations had been captured, but what his next move should be in a situation that seemed to grow more complex with each revelation. What are you suggesting I do? He asked, his voice carrying the particular vulnerability of someone who had run out of situations they knew how to control through money or authority. Maria thought about her own children, about the mistakes they had made, and the grace she had extended when they needed forgiveness more than justice. She thought about Frederick's deceased wife, whose memory haunted the mansion like a reminder of the love that had once made this house a home rather than just a showcase for wealth. I'm suggesting that maybe this time you choose to be Anthony's father instead of his judge, she said quietly. Find him. Talk to him. Give him a chance to explain what he's gotten himself into before you decide whether he's worth saving or worth sacrificing. Frederick was quiet for a long time, turning the recording device over in his hands as if its weight could help him calculate the right decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had discovered that being right wasn't the same thing as being wise. And if he's involved in something that could destroy not just him, but our entire family, if this surveillance operation is connected to organized crime or corporate espionage, what then? Maria met his eyes with the certainty of someone who had navigated poverty, loss, and survival without the cushion of unlimited wealth. Then you help him find a way out. Because families are supposed to save each other, Mr. Callahan, even when, especially when, they don't deserve it. As she left Frederick's study, Maria carried with her the weight of having stepped far beyond the boundaries that normally separated employer from employee, wealthy from working class, those who made decisions from those who simply implemented them. She had no way of knowing whether her words would influence Frederick's next choices, but she knew that she had spoken from the part of herself that understood that some truths were worth the risk of losing everything to tell. The mansion continued its morning routine around her, marble floors gleaming under her mop, expensive surfaces reflecting her careful work. But Maria Elena Vasquez was no longer just invisible help maintaining someone else's wealth. She had become a voice speaking for mercy in a house that had forgotten the difference between justice and love. And whatever happened next, she had given the Callahan family one last chance to choose healing over destruction, forgiveness over revenge, and the messy complications of love over the clean simplicity of being right. The security sweep began that afternoon with the precision of a military operation, and Maria watched from the periphery as specialists with electronic detection equipment methodically examined every room of the mansion. Frederick had made his decision. Instead of immediately involving law enforcement, he was conducting a private investigation to determine the full scope of whatever surveillance operation had been targeting his family. The team leader, a former FBI agent whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise his law enforcement background, briefed Frederick in the study while Maria cleaned nearby rooms, her position allowing her to observe without appearing to eavesdrop. The conversation was technical and grimly professional, filled with references to electronic signatures, transmission frequencies, and sophisticated surveillance networks that suggested the recording device she had found was only one component of a much larger operation. The device your employee discovered was military-grade, the security specialist explained, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news to powerful people. This isn't some private investigator's listening device or paparazzi equipment. Someone with significant resources and professional training has been monitoring your family's communications, and they've been doing it for months. Frederick's response was barely audible, but Maria could see his shoulders tense as the full implications became clear. How much could they have recorded? Potentially everything, came the blunt reply. Private conversations, business discussions, family arguments, financial planning sessions. If this device was connected to a broader network, and our preliminary scans suggest it was, then whoever placed it has been building a comprehensive profile of your family's personal and business activities. The sweep continued throughout the afternoon, with specialists using equipment that looked more suited to a spy movie than a domestic security consultation. They found 3 additional devices, one in Frederick's private office, another in the master bedroom, and a third in the mansion's main entertainment area. Each discovery deepened the mystery of who had been conducting the surveillance and what they hoped to gain from such comprehensive monitoring of the Callahan family's private life. As evening approached, Frederick requested a private meeting with the security team leader, and Maria found herself assigned to clean the same hallway outside the study where the conversation was taking place. The discussion that followed would have been inaudible to most people, but Maria's 30 years of working in houses where privacy was a luxury had taught her to move silently and listen carefully when circumstances required it. The sophistication of this operation suggests either corporate espionage or organized crime involvement, the specialist was explaining. Your business dealings, particularly the cryptocurrency investments and international real estate holdings, make you a high-value target for people who might profit from advanced knowledge of your financial moves. Frederick's voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him years in moments. Or someone could be using this information to blackmail my family. Personal conversations, private arguments, vulnerable moments. There's plenty there that could be used against us. That's certainly possible, the specialist agreed. But there's another possibility we need to consider. The timing of your son's theft, combined with the sophistication of this surveillance operation, suggests these events might be connected. Someone may have been feeding your son information about your security systems, your financial holdings, even your personal routines. The silence that followed was so profound that Maria could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the marble hallway. The suggestion that Anthony's theft might have been orchestrated or encouraged by outside parties added a new dimension to the family's crisis. one that transformed a simple case of betrayal between father and son into something much more dangerous and complex. When Frederick finally spoke, his voice carried the particular strain of someone who was beginning to understand that the ground beneath his feet was far less stable than he had believed. "Are you suggesting that my son was manipulated into stealing from me?" "I'm suggesting that $32 million is a lot of money to steal impulsively," the specialist replied. "The bearer bonds alone require sophisticated knowledge to convert to cash without triggering financial monitoring systems. The cryptocurrency wallet codes would need to be transferred through channels that avoid federal oversight." "Either your son has resources and expertise far beyond what you've described, or he had help from people who do." Maria felt the weight of the conversation settling over her like a physical burden. The recording device she had discovered was apparently just the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink not just Anthony, but potentially the entire Callahan family. If Frederick's son had become involved with people sophisticated enough to conduct months of high-level surveillance, then the danger extended far beyond family disagreements and financial theft. As the security specialists concluded their briefing and departed with promises to conduct broader investigations into the surveillance network, Frederick remained in his study long past his usual schedule. Maria could see him through the glass doors, surrounded by financial documents and security reports, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each new piece of information. Near midnight, as Maria prepared to end her longest day at the mansion, she made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of departing through the service entrance as usual, she approached Frederick's study and knocked softly on the glass door. He looked up with the expression of someone who had been wrestling with impossible decisions for hours, and Maria could see in his eyes the particular desperation that comes when a parent realizes their child might be in danger that runs deeper than anything money or authority can fix. "Mr. Callahan," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about what the security specialist said about your son possibly being manipulated or used by people with professional surveillance capabilities." Frederick gestured for her to enter the study, his usual boundaries between employer and employee apparently dissolved by the gravity of the situation they both found themselves navigating. "You have something to add?" he asked, his voice carrying hope that someone, anyone, might have insight that could help him understand how to save his son from whatever web he had become entangled in. Maria chose her words carefully, understanding that she was speaking not just as an employee, but as someone who had witnessed the family's destruction from the beginning, and who perhaps understood better than anyone how desperate love could lead people to make alliances with dangerous partners. "I've seen young people make terrible choices when they feel like they have no other options," she said, "and I've seen families torn apart because parents and children stop talking to each other when they should be protecting each other. If Anthony is mixed up with people who could conduct this kind of surveillance operation, then he's not just your son who stole from you. He's your son who might be in more danger than he knows how to handle." Frederick was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the vulnerability of someone who was finally ready to admit that his wealth and business expertise had not prepared him for the complexity of saving a family that was falling apart. "How do I find him?" he asked. "How do I reach out to a son I've just disowned and cut off financially to tell him he might be in danger from people I don't understand?" Maria thought about her own children, about the phone calls that came at 3 a.m. when they were in trouble, about the way love sometimes required parents to swallow their pride and extend help to children who had made mistakes that couldn't be easily forgiven. "You start by calling him," she said simply. "You tell him you've discovered the surveillance equipment. You tell him you're worried about his safety, and you tell him that being right about his theft matters less than making sure he comes home alive." As Maria finally left the mansion that night, she carried with her the image of Frederick reaching for his phone with the trembling hands of a father who was finally ready to choose love over law, family over justice, and the messy complications of mercy over the clean simplicity of being right. The recording device that had brought them all to this moment sat on his desk like evidence that some truths were worth the risk of everything to discover, and that some families were worth the courage of everything to save. The phone call that would determine the Callahan family's fate was less dramatic than novella dialogue and more heartbreaking than any scriptwriter could have imagined, because real reconciliation between people who have wounded each other deeply rarely comes with romantic background music or perfectly timed declarations of love. It comes with halting words, long silences, and the particular awkwardness of people trying to rebuild trust that has been shattered by anger and pride. Frederick sat in his study until nearly 3 a.m, staring at his phone as if it were a loaded weapon that could either save his son or destroy what remained of their relationship forever. The investigation into the surveillance equipment had revealed the scope of the danger Anthony might be facing, but it had also forced Frederick to confront the possibility that his own rigid response to his son's theft had pushed Anthony further into whatever dangerous alliance had made the crime possible in the first place. When he finally dialed Anthony's number, the phone rang 6 times before a voice answered. That sounded nothing like the confident young man who had grown up surrounded by wealth and privilege. Anthony sounded exhausted, scared, and hollow, like someone who had discovered that $32 million was a price too high to pay for his father's attention. "Dad?" The single word carried years of pain, hope, and the particular wariness that comes when you've been expecting the worst news possible. Frederick had prepared speeches during his sleepless hours, had practiced explanations that would demonstrate both authority and compassion. But when the moment came, he found himself speaking with the simplicity of someone who had finally learned the difference between being a successful businessman and being a successful father. "Anthony, I need you to come home. Not because I'm ready to forgive what you did, and not because everything is suddenly fine between us, but because you might be in danger, and whatever mistakes you've made, whatever people you've gotten involved with, you're still my son." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Frederick began to wonder if the connection had been lost, but then Anthony's voice came through with the particular tremor of someone who had been carrying fear alone, and was finally hearing an offer of help. "I am in trouble, Dad. Bad trouble. Worse than just stealing from you?" A pause, then. "The people who helped me figure out how to get the bonds and the cryptocurrency codes, they weren't doing it out of kindness. They want something from our family, something worth a lot more than $32 million. Frederick felt his stomach drop as his worst fears about the surveillance operation began to crystallize into specific threats against his family. "What do they want?" Anthony's answer came with the shame of someone confessing to a mistake that had spiraled far beyond their ability to control. "Information about your business deals, your cryptocurrency wallets, your real estate transactions. They've been recording conversations in the house for months, Dad. They know about deals you haven't even announced publicly, and they want me to help them access your offshore accounts." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, with Anthony providing details about a criminal organization that had approached him months earlier, offering assistance with his financial problems in exchange for information about the Callahan family's business operations. What had begun as a simple arrangement helping sophisticated thieves understand the mansion's security systems had evolved into something much more dangerous as the criminals realized the scope of Frederick's international financial holdings. "They have recordings of you discussing cryptocurrency investments worth hundreds of millions," Anthony explained, his voice breaking with the weight of what he had unleashed. "They know about the gold stored in Swiss banks, the real estate deals being negotiated in Monaco, the tech startup acquisitions you're planning for next quarter. Dad, they don't just want to steal money. They want to use insider information to manipulate entire markets." Frederick listened with the growing horror of someone who was beginning to understand that his son's attempt to steal $32 million had inadvertently exposed financial operations worth billions to people who specialized in the kind of sophisticated theft that could destabilize international markets. The surveillance equipment Maria had discovered was apparently just one component of an operation that treated the Callahan family's private information as a gateway to committing financial crimes on a global scale. "Where are you now?" Frederick asked, his parental instincts overriding his business concerns as he focused on the immediate danger to his son. "I'm at a hotel in South Beach, but I don't think I'm safe here much longer. Anthony replied. "These people don't forgive betrayal, Dad, and returning the bonds and cryptocurrency codes to you instead of delivering them as promised. They're not happy about that." Frederick was already reaching for his other phone to call the private security team when Anthony's next words stopped him cold. "Dad, there's something else, something worse. They know about Maria." The mention of the maid who had discovered the surveillance equipment sent a chill through Frederick that had nothing to do with the mansion's air conditioning. What about Maria? They know she found one of their recording devices. They know she turned it over to you instead of just ignoring it. And they know she influenced your decision to reach out to me instead of just calling the FBI. Anthony's voice carried the particular desperation of someone who had realized that his mistakes would endanger innocent people. "These aren't just white-collar criminals, Dad. They're people who eliminate threats to their operations." Frederick felt the ground shifting beneath him as he understood that Maria Elena Vasquez, a woman who cleaned his floors and asked only for respect and dignity in return, had become a target of dangerous criminals simply because she had done the right thing at the right moment. The same compassion that had prompted her to speak about mercy instead of justice had now put her life at risk. "Anthony, I need you to come home immediately, and I need you to tell me everything you know about these people. Names, locations, how they contacted you, what they're planning next. Everything." "I'm scared, Dad," Anthony said, and for the first time since childhood, he sounded like Frederick's little boy instead of a trust fund heir who had never learned the value of anything. "I've made such a mess of everything, and now people might get hurt because of my selfishness." Frederick thought about Maria's words from earlier that day, about choosing to be Anthony's father instead of his judge, about families saving each other even when they didn't deserve it. The crisis had evolved far beyond questions of theft and forgiveness into something that would require them to work together to protect not just themselves, but an innocent woman whose only crime had been caring about their family's welfare. "Listen to me carefully," Frederick said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had built a business empire but was now focused on something more important than money. "You made mistakes, but you're trying to fix them now. We're going to figure this out together, but I need you to get home safely first. I'm sending a security team to pick you up, and we're going to make sure Maria is protected while we figure out how to deal with these people." As he ended the call with Anthony, Frederick realized that the recording device Maria had discovered had been both a revelation and a salvation. Without her careful decision to bring it to him privately, without her words about choosing family over law, he might have continued down a path that would have delivered Anthony directly into the hands of people who would have used him until he was no longer useful, then eliminated him as a liability. The irony was not lost on Frederick that Maria Elena Vasquez, a woman he had barely noticed despite her daily presence in his house, someone he had considered simply as part of the mansion's maintenance staff, had become the person whose wisdom and courage were now essential to saving his family from destruction. Her insight into the difference between justice and mercy, her recognition that Anthony might be more victim than perpetrator, and her willingness to risk her own position to speak truth to power had potentially saved not just the Callahan family, but prevented a financial crime that could have affected global markets. As Frederick began making calls to mobilize security teams, legal advisors, and financial protection specialists, he carried with him a new understanding of what his deceased wife Catherine had tried to teach him about the difference between being wealthy and being wise, between having money and having value, between being successful in business and being successful as a human being. The next several hours would determine whether the Callahan family could emerge from this crisis intact, but Frederick now understood that their survival would depend not on his billions in assets, but on something much rarer and more valuable: the courage to choose love over pride, mercy over judgment, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. Maria Elena Vasquez had no idea, as she prepared for sleep in her small apartment in Little Havana, that she had become central to a story that was about to test every principle she had ever held about family, loyalty, and the price of doing the right thing. when doing the right thing put everything at risk. The dawn that broke over Miami's skyline carried with it the weight of decisions made in the dark hours before sunrise, when the Callahan mansion had been transformed from a showcase of wealth into something resembling a fortress under siege. Frederick's calls throughout the night had mobilized not just private security teams, but financial advisors, legal specialists, and technology experts who understood that the threat facing his family extended far beyond simple theft into territory that could affect international markets and potentially national security. Maria arrived at the service entrance to find the mansion transformed by visible security measures and an atmosphere of controlled crisis management that reminded her of news footage from high-stakes criminal investigations. The normal morning routine had been replaced by efficiently coordinated movements of people whose expensive suits and serious expressions suggested they were accustomed to dealing with situations where millions of dollars and human lives hung in the balance. Consuela met her at the staff entrance with an expression that mixed worry with the particular resignation of someone who had worked for wealthy families long enough to know that drama and danger often traveled together in their world. "Everything is different today," she said without preamble, her weathered hands gesturing toward the main house where the sounds of multiple conversations in several languages created a background hum of activity. "Mr. Anthony is back. The house is full of security people, and Mr. Frederick wants to speak with you personally as soon as you arrive." The request to meet with Frederick privately sent a chill through Maria that had nothing to do with the mansion's air conditioning. She had crossed professional boundaries by speaking to him about family matters, and Mercy had inserted herself into situations that were far above her position as domestic help, and now found herself summoned for what could be either recognition or termination. She was directed not to Frederick's usual study, but to a smaller, more secure room that she had never entered before, a space that looked more like a corporate conference room than the part of a family residence. The walls were lined with financial documents and electronic equipment, and the large table was covered with papers, laptops, and what appeared to be surveillance detection devices. Frederick looked like a man who had aged years in the span of a single night, but when he saw Maria enter the room, his expression carried something she had never seen before from him: genuine gratitude mixed with the particular urgency of someone who needed her help more than he needed to maintain the social boundaries that separated employer from employee. "Maria," he said, standing as she entered, "I need to thank you for what you did yesterday, and I need to ask if you're willing to help us deal with something much more dangerous than I initially understood." Before she could respond, Anthony emerged from a chair where he had been sitting quietly, and Maria was struck by how much the young man had changed even in the few days since she had last seen him. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized his bearing were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine fear, mixed with the particular shame that comes when someone realizes the full consequences of their mistakes. "Mrs. Vasquez," Anthony said, his voice carrying a humility she had never heard from him before, "I owe you an apology. My father explained that you tried to help him understand that I might be in more trouble than just the theft. You were right, and your insight might have saved my life." Frederick gestured for Maria to sit at the conference table, and as she did, she found herself surrounded by evidence of a criminal investigation that appeared to involve multiple law enforcement agencies, private security firms, and financial institutions. The recording device she had discovered had apparently been just one piece of a puzzle that painted a picture of organized crime operating at an international level. "The people who helped Anthony access our family's financial information are part of a criminal organization that specializes in financial espionage," Frederick explained, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone delivering news that could affect national security. "They've been using surveillance equipment to gather information not just about our family's personal business, but about financial transactions that could allow them to manipulate cryptocurrency markets worth billions of dollars." Maria listened with growing horror as the scope of the criminal operation became clear. The recording devices had captured not just family conversations, but detailed discussions of international business deals, cryptocurrency investments, and financial strategies that represented information valuable enough to destabilize global markets if used by sophisticated criminals. "The FBI is involved now," Anthony added, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who had realized that his attempt to impress his father with stolen millions had inadvertently exposed them all to dangers that could not be solved with money or lawyers. But the criminals know that we've discovered their surveillance operation, and they know that Mrs. Vasquez was the one who found their equipment. The words hit Maria like a physical blow as she realized that her decision to do the right thing, to turn over the recording device instead of ignoring it, to speak to Frederick about choosing mercy over justice, had apparently made her a target of people who eliminated threats to their criminal operations. Frederick leaned forward, his expression carrying the particular intensity of someone who was about to ask someone to undertake a dangerous mission. Maria, the FBI believes that these criminals will try to eliminate anyone who can connect them to the surveillance operation. That includes Anthony, that includes me, and unfortunately, that includes you. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of waves against the mansion's seawall and the muted conversations of security personnel in adjacent rooms. Maria found herself thinking not about her own safety, but about the way complicated situations had a way of revealing who people really were when everything they valued was at stake. "What are you asking me to do?" she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Anthony answered first, his words carrying the urgency of someone who had learned that some mistakes could not be undone, but could potentially be turned into something redemptive. "The FBI wants to use our family as bait to draw these criminals into a trap. They want us to appear to resume normal activities while actually being under surveillance and protection, hoping that the criminals will make a move that allows law enforcement to capture them." Frederick took over the explanation, his voice carrying the particular gravity of someone who understood they were asking an employee to risk her life for a family that had never properly appreciated her contributions until crisis made her value clear. "Maria, you've already demonstrated more courage and wisdom than anyone should be required to show. You found the surveillance equipment, you spoke truth to me when I needed to hear it, and you helped save my relationship with my son. Now we're asking if you're willing to help us finish this, to continue working in the mansion while law enforcement uses our daily routines to catch criminals who threaten not just our family, but potentially the stability of financial systems that affect millions of people." Maria thought about her own children, about the neighborhood where she lived, about the working people whose lives could be affected if criminals succeeded in manipulating markets that controlled the value of their savings and their futures. She thought about Frederick's deceased wife, Catherine, whose memory had haunted the mansion, but whose values, as described by her husband and son, apparently included the kind of courage that chose to protect others even when personal risk was involved. "These people," she said carefully, "if they're as dangerous as you say, what happens to my own family if I help you? What happens to my neighbors, my community, if these criminals decide that hurting them will pressure me to stop cooperation with law enforcement?" The question demonstrated the kind of practical wisdom that comes from surviving poverty and understanding that working people rarely have the luxury of making decisions that only affect themselves. Frederick's response carried a recognition that true security for Maria would require protections that extended beyond just her personal safety. "The FBI has agreed to provide security not just for you but for your family members and your community," he said. "And Maria, if you're willing to help us with this operation, you won't just be helping to capture criminals who threaten financial markets, you'll be helping to ensure that no other families go through what we've experienced, that no other young people get manipulated into criminal associations because they're desperate for their parents' approval." As Maria considered the request, she found herself thinking about all the families she had worked for over 30 years, all the houses where she had witnessed the particular loneliness that unlimited wealth could not cure, all the children who had grown up surrounded by material abundance but starved for the kind of love and attention that could not be purchased. The Callahan family's crisis had revealed something important about the difference between having money and having value, between being wealthy and being wise. Frederick's billions in assets had not protected him from making mistakes that pushed his son toward dangerous people. But Maria's insight into the importance of choosing mercy over justice had potentially saved them all from destruction. "I'll help you," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had carried her through decades of invisible work in other people's houses. "Not because I owe you anything, and not because I'm not afraid, but because families are supposed to protect each other, and communities are supposed to protect each other, and sometimes that means taking risks that money can't make safe." Frederick's response carried something Maria had never heard from him before. Genuine respect for someone he was finally seeing not as hired help, but as a person whose courage and wisdom were essential to his family's survival. "Thank you, Maria, and I want you to know that whatever happens with this operation, you'll always have a place in our family. Not as an employee, but as someone who helped save us when we didn't deserve saving and couldn't save ourselves." As the meeting concluded and Maria prepared to begin what would be the most dangerous work week of her life, she carried with her the understanding that the Callahan family's story was approaching a conclusion that would test everything they had learned about love, loyalty, and the price of redemption. The recording device she had discovered had started a chain of events that would now determine not just their survival, but their transformation into people who understood the difference between being wealthy and being worthy of the trust that others placed in them. The mansion would continue to gleam with marble and crystal. Its rooms would remain filled with objects worth more than most people's annual salaries, but Maria Elena Vasquez would no longer be invisible within its walls. She had become central to a story about the way love could triumph over law, courage could overcome wealth, and the wisdom to choose mercy over justice could save families that seemed beyond redemption. The FBI operation transformed the Callahan mansion into something that resembled a movie set where the actors were performing their normal lives while cameras rolled and directors watched from hidden positions, except that the stakes were real and the criminals they were hoping to capture were deadly professionals who had built their operation on the foundation that anyone who threatened their enterprise would be permanently eliminated. Maria's role in the operation required her to maintain her normal cleaning schedule while actually serving as one of the primary observation points for law enforcement agents who needed eyes and ears in every corner of the mansion. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that the woman who had spent months being invisible to the Callahan family was now essential to their survival. Her intimate knowledge of the house's routines and hidden spaces, making her invaluable to agents who needed to predict where criminals might attempt to place new surveillance equipment or stage an attack. The first 3 days of the operation passed with a particular tension that comes when everyone involved knows they are performing normalcy while waiting for violence to erupt at any moment. Frederick returned to his usual schedule of business meetings and financial reviews, but now each conversation was carefully scripted to provide information that would be valuable enough to draw the criminals into revealing themselves while not actually compromising legitimate business operations. Anthony, meanwhile, had been assigned the most dangerous role in the operation, maintaining contact with the criminal organization through carefully monitored communications that suggested he was still willing to cooperate with their demands while actually providing law enforcement with intelligence about their plans and capabilities. The young man who had stolen $32 million in a misguided attempt to win his father's respect was now risking his life to help capture the people who had manipulated his desperation. Maria found herself observing dynamics that she had never expected to witness in any of the wealthy houses where she had worked. The crisis had stripped away the social barriers that normally separated family members from each other and employers from employees, creating a situation where survival depended on genuine cooperation rather than polite distance. Frederick, who had spent months barely acknowledging Maria's presence, now sought her input on everything from daily schedules to security protocols, recognizing that her understanding of the mansion's rhythms was essential to making the FBI's plan work. Anthony, who had previously treated her with the casual dismissiveness that wealthy young people often showed toward service staff, now spoke to her with the respect of someone who understood that she was risking her own safety to help save his life. On the 4th day of the operation, the criminals made their first move. It began with what appeared to be a routine delivery, a florist's van arriving at the service entrance with an elaborate arrangement that was supposedly ordered for the mansion's main dining room. The delivery driver appeared professional and legitimate, his credentials checked out through the systems that florists typically used, and the arrangement itself was the kind of expensive display that regularly appeared in houses like the Callahan Mansion. But Maria, whose 30 years of managing household deliveries had taught her to notice details that others might miss, observed something about the delivery that triggered her instincts. The driver's hands, while clean and professional, showed calluses in places that suggested familiarity with more dangerous tools than floral shears. His eyes, while polite and deferential, moved with the particular alertness of someone conducting surveillance rather than someone simply delivering flowers. Most importantly, the floral arrangement itself, while beautiful, contained elements that seemed wrong for a legitimate florist's work. Small electronic components hidden among the greenery that were sophisticated enough to serve as either listening devices or something more dangerous. Maria's signal to the FBI agents monitoring the mansion, a simple adjustment of the window blinds in the room where she was working, triggered an immediate response that revealed just how extensive the law enforcement operation had become. Within minutes, the mansion was surrounded by agents whose positions had been invisible until the moment when they moved to intercept what turned out to be not just a surveillance attempt, but a preliminary reconnaissance for what the criminals had planned as a coordinated attack on everyone involved in the investigation. The arrest of the delivery driver led to the discovery of explosives in the florist's van, weapons that suggested the criminal organization had decided to eliminate all witnesses to their surveillance operation rather than risk continued law enforcement investigation. The driver, when questioned, revealed details of a plan that would have targeted not just the Callahan family but the FBI agents protecting them, turning the mansion into a battlefield where no one was expected to survive. The information extracted from the captured criminal led to simultaneous raids on locations across Miami and several other cities, resulting in the arrest of more than 30 people involved in what federal prosecutors described as one of the most sophisticated financial espionage operations ever discovered in the United States. The surveillance equipment found in the mansion had been just one component of a network that was gathering intelligence on dozens of wealthy families, tech entrepreneurs, and financial institutions. But for Maria, the most significant moment of the entire operation came not during the dramatic arrests or the dangerous reconnaissance that could have resulted in multiple deaths, but during a quiet conversation with Frederick and Anthony that occurred after the immediate danger had passed, and they were finally able to speak freely about what they had all survived together. "I need you both to understand something," Frederick said, his voice carrying the particular humility of someone who had learned important truths about himself during a crisis. "Maria, your courage saved not just our family, but potentially prevented a financial crime that could have affected millions of people. Anthony, your willingness to risk your own safety to help capture these criminals showed me that the son I thought I had lost was actually just waiting for a chance to prove his worth through something other than money." Anthony's response carried the maturity that comes when someone has faced consequences that cannot be solved through privilege or wealth. "Dad, I need you to know that stealing from you was the stupidest thing I've ever done, but it also led to me understanding something important about what really matters. Mrs. Vasquez risked her life for our family even after we treated her like she was invisible for months. She showed me what real dignity looks like." Maria found herself thinking about her own journey from invisible domestic worker to essential participant in a federal law enforcement operation, from someone whose opinions were never sought to someone whose insights were crucial to saving lives and preventing crimes. The transformation had revealed something important about the way crisis could strip away artificial barriers and reveal the true character of everyone involved. "Mr. Callahan," she said, choosing her words carefully, "your son made mistakes, but he also found the courage to try to fix them when fixing them put him in danger. That's not something a bad person does. That's something someone who was taught right from wrong does when they finally get a chance to prove they learned the lessons." Frederick's response carried the wonder of someone who had discovered that wealth could not purchase the most valuable things in life, but that those things could sometimes be found in unexpected places by people who had the wisdom to recognize them. Maria, I've spent my entire adult life believing that success meant accumulating assets and building wealth. But this crisis taught me that real success means building relationships with people who will risk their own safety to save you when you can't save yourself. You and Anthony both showed me what that kind of loyalty looks like. The conversation had begun with fears about surveillance and criminal threats, but it concluded with something rarer and more valuable than any of Frederick's billion-dollar investments: the understanding that families were not built on money but on the willingness of people to love each other despite their mistakes, to choose mercy over judgment, and to risk everything to protect what truly mattered. As Maria prepared to return to her normal schedule of work in the mansion, though her role would never again be invisible or unappreciated, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that her decision to do the right thing had led to consequences beyond anything she could have imagined. The recording device she had found had started a chain of events that saved not just the Callahan family, but potentially prevented crimes that could have affected global financial markets. But more importantly, her willingness to speak truth about mercy and family had helped heal relationships that might otherwise have been destroyed by pride and pain. She had witnessed the transformation of a billionaire who had learned that wealth without wisdom was worthless, and of a young man who had discovered that real worth came from courage rather than cash. The mansion would continue to gleam with marble and crystal. Its rooms would remain filled with objects that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But it would no longer be a showcase for empty wealth. It had become a home where people who had learned to value each other more than money could live with the knowledge that they had survived not just criminal threats, but the more dangerous temptation to choose law over love, pride over family, and the sterile satisfaction of being right over the messy complications of being human. 6 months after the FBI operation concluded with the successful prosecution of the financial espionage network, the Callahan mansion had been transformed in ways that no amount of money could have purchased, but that love and forgiveness had made possible. The marble floors still gleamed under Maria's careful attention. The crystal chandeliers still cast perfect light across rooms filled with priceless artwork. But the house itself felt fundamentally different, alive with the warmth that comes when a family learns to choose each other over everything else that once seemed important. Frederick's business empire continued to thrive, his investments in cryptocurrency and international real estate generating returns that regularly appeared in financial publications. But his relationship with money had been forever changed by understanding that the most valuable things in his life could not be calculated in dollars or measured in assets. The man who had once signed legal papers to disown his son now spent time each day teaching Anthony about business operations with the patience of someone who understood that wisdom was more important than wealth. Anthony, meanwhile, had used his experience with a criminal organization to develop expertise in financial security that made him valuable to his father's business operations in ways that went far beyond trust fund entitlement. The young man who had stolen $32 million in a misguided attempt to prove his worth was now designing systems to protect other wealthy families from the kind of sophisticated surveillance and manipulation that had nearly destroyed the Callahans. But perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred in Maria's role within the mansion and the family. The woman who had once cleaned floors while remaining invisible had become someone whose opinion was sought on everything from family decisions to business strategies, whose presence was valued not just for her work, but for her insight into the difference between having money and having worth. The change had begun with Frederick's decision to offer Maria a position as the mansion's head of household operations, a role that came with a salary that reflected genuine appreciation for her contributions rather than the minimum wage that domestic workers typically received. But more importantly, it came with respect, recognition, and the understanding that her voice mattered in a family that had learned to value wisdom over wealth. "Maria," Frederick said during one of their weekly meetings about household management and family matters, "I need you to know that what you did for our family went beyond courage or even kindness. You showed us how to choose love over law, mercy over judgment, and family over everything else that we thought mattered. That's not something I can ever fully repay." Maria's response carried the quiet dignity that had sustained her through 30 years of invisible work in other people's houses. "Mr. Callahan, families are supposed to save each other. What I did was just remember something I learned from my own mother, that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing to do, but it's still the only thing to do." The mansion's daily rhythms now included moments that would have been impossible during the months when grief and pride had kept the family isolated from each other. Frederick and Anthony worked together in the study that had once been a fortress of solitude, their conversations mixing business planning with the kind of personal connection that had been missing since Catherine's death. The breakfast room heard laughter again. The gardens bloomed with flowers that Maria tended not as part of her duties, but as expressions of love for a home that had finally become more than just a showcase for wealth. There were still challenges, of course. Anthony's recovery from his association with criminals included therapy and ongoing legal obligations related to his cooperation with federal prosecutors. Frederick's relationship with money remained complicated as he worked to understand the difference between using wealth responsibly and being controlled by the pursuit of assets. And Maria herself had to adjust to being valued and respected in ways that felt foreign after decades of being treated as invisible help. But the family had learned something that money could not purchase, and that crisis had been required to teach: that real security came not from financial assets, but from relationships built on mutual respect, genuine care, and the willingness to choose each other, even when choosing each other was difficult. The recording device that had started the entire transformation sat now on Frederick's desk, not as evidence of surveillance and criminal threats, but as a reminder of the way small actions could lead to profound changes. Maria's decision to turn it over to Frederick instead of ignoring it, her words about choosing mercy over justice, her willingness to risk her own safety to help capture dangerous criminals, all of it had grown from a moment when someone chose to do the right thing despite the personal cost. As evening fell over Biscayne Bay and the mansion's lights reflected off the water like scattered jewels, Maria prepared to end another day of work that no longer felt like work, because it was performed in a home where she was valued rather than invisible, appreciated rather than taken for granted, respected rather than merely tolerated. Frederick found her in the kitchen, preparing to depart for her apartment in Little Havana, and his expression carried the particular gratitude of someone who understood that his family's survival had depended on the courage and wisdom of someone he had spent months failing to truly see. "Maria," he said, "I know you've been considering our offer to move to the staff quarters here in the mansion, and I want you to know that the offer comes not because we need you to be available around the clock, but because you've become part of our family. The choice of where you live should reflect what makes you happiest, not what's most convenient for us." Maria smiled with the warmth of someone who had found her way from invisible service to genuine belonging. "Mr. Callahan, I love my neighborhood in Little Havana. I love the music from open windows and children playing in the streets and the smell of Cuban coffee in the morning. But I also love working here now, in a house where I'm seen and heard and valued. Maybe home isn't about choosing one place or the other. Maybe home is about being somewhere you matter to people who matter to you." As she made her way toward the service entrance that she would always use out of habit and preference rather than requirement, Maria carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that a story which had begun with surveillance equipment and criminal threats had concluded with something much more valuable: the transformation of a family that had learned to choose love over law, wisdom over wealth, and each other over everything else that had once seemed important. The Callahan mansion would continue to represent extraordinary wealth. Its rooms would remain filled with objects and artwork worth more than most people could imagine, but it would also represent something rarer and more precious: the knowledge that the most valuable things in life could not be purchased, only earned through the courage to choose what was right over what was easy, what was loving over what was legally justified, and what built families rather than what merely accumulated assets. And you, have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where doing the right thing put you at risk, but you did it anyway because families and communities are supposed to protect each other? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs to hear today that her courage and wisdom matter, that her voice has value, and that families, whether biological or chosen, are worth the risk of everything to save. For more heartfelt stories that honor the strength and dignity of working women, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us, for understanding that love sometimes requires choosing mercy over justice, and for remembering that the most important transformations happen not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the quiet moments when people decide to choose each other. See you in our next story, where we'll continue exploring the powerful truth that real wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from whom we choose to love and protect when everything else falls away.